FLM, wide open thinking, world-class work, and far-reaching results. Now with locations in Minneapolis, Columbus, Indianapolis, and Washington, D.C. A strategic marketing and communications company dedicated to serving clients who specialize in the business of agriculture and the life of rural communities.
Thank you for joining us for our latest Meet the Farmhands video, joined today by Burton Eller with Burton Eller Associates on the National Grange. Burton, thanks for taking the time to join us.
You bet, Spencer. I've enjoyed watching your previous videos.
All right, we'll see if we can make another good one here. And let's start out by just kind of talking about a timeline of your career, going back as far as you'd like to go, places you've been, places you've worked throughout your time in Washington.
My goodness, I've been in and out of Washington about 4 or 5 times. Started my career, I thought I was going to start my career as an engineer, and found out in college that I didn't like to be inanimate all day long, so I switched over to animal science and went back to my roots. I swore I'd never go back to the farm, never go back to agriculture, and that's where I ended up. Graduated with a master's degree, and before I finished it, I went to work for the Virginia Hereford Association, which basically promoted the Herefords and polled Herefords and managed sales up and down the East Coast. Back then we were doing about $1 million worth of sales, and that was pretty big money back several years ago. Then I had an opportunity to go to work with the cattlemen in Denver. They needed somebody young and ready to go to work to do membership and revenue development. And I was there for a while, and that was when the big feedlot expansion was happening all over the High Plains. And the far feedlots in Greeley, Colorado needed someone to background southeast mismanaged calves and send them out for their feedlots. So I came back home to the home farm, rented some other land around our county, and went into the stocker business for a while, bringing long-tail calves out of the south and putting a couple 100 pounds and straightening them out and send them to the far feedlots. During that time, the cattlemen decided to open up a Washington office. And Bill McMillan at that time, who was the CEO in Denver, would travel back and forth on a plane to Washington, and he was establishing himself full-time in Washington. He called up one day and said, "I need some help in Washington. Why don't you talk to your wife and come back?" I said, "Oh, Bill, it would take XXX to do it." And what I didn't realize is that was country dollars, that wasn't Washington dollars. A few days later, he said, "Pack your bags, be here January 1. So I came to Washington and helped expand the Washington office. Then in a few years, when Bill was asked to be Assistant Secretary of Agriculture, the board tapped me to be head of the Washington office, there for several years. And then the CEO at that time, John Mates, left, and again the board tapped me to be CEO in Denver, so I traveled to Denver. Helped put the merger. During that time, of course, we were able to get the beef checkoff through Congress.
Right.
Several other good pieces of legislation, including equal to inspection for foreign inspection. We were able to expand our membership about 400% during that period, so it was a good time. And we helped put the merger together between the National Livestock and Meat Board and the old National Cattlemen's Association to form the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. Mm-hmm. Following that, I decided I always wanted to go to do a little Capitol Hill work on my own, and so I went to work with McLeod, Watkinson, Miller for a little while, and did the boutique law firm lobby for a while, and that was the people in that firm are actually wonderful. They were good partners. Recruited out of there to be president of the Textile Rental Services Association, headquartered down just south of Fort Lauderdale. And that was an experience, good and bad. It was an awful place to do business. It was a nice place to live, at least in the wintertime. In the summertime, it got hot. Mm-hmm. And then following that, I went to the administration with an appointment over to the Farm Service Agency, then joined Bruce Knight as deputy under in agriculture over APHIS and grain inspection and packers and stockyards and ag marketing service. And golly, things just kind of mushroomed from there. Went to Burton Eller Associates. Well, I actually went back to the cattlemen for a little while to work on the Washington office. There were some good folks there. We just needed to round that out. I then went to form Burton Eller Associates, and a wide variety of smaller clients doing, and it's good one-on-one type stuff. I kind of have marketed myself as the guy with rural roots and small town and small business type of background. And the president of National Grange a couple years ago called me in and said, "Let's talk about it." He said, "I need somebody who can hit the ground running with policy, with advocacy, with legislation, with government affairs. And so after about 6 months of consulting, I came on a lot more time with the National Grange. And it's a great fit. I never thought that I would be over into the healthcare, broadband connectivity. With the Grange, I'm doing a world of rural issues, whatever they are, whether it's connectivity for high school kids that have to go down at night after they do chores, to the library and sit outside because the library's closed to connect and do homework, or whether it's the baby boomer generation in rural America that's aging and catching up with healthcare, or healthcare is not catching up with them.
Mm-hmm. So a lot of places over the course of that career, but the majority of them were located here in Washington. When you first moved here, was the plan to be in Washington this long?
Oh, it's just never. No, but of course it's like when I left the farm. I said I'm never coming back. I'm never going back into agriculture, and that's where I've been all my life. I came to Washington, said that's great. I can't imagine being up there very long, but I'll go help Bill out. It'll teach me some things, and I'll have some fun. And I've been in and out of Washington about 5 times since.
Mm-hmm. Over the course of your time in town with the various lobbying shops that you've worked for, how have you seen lobbying and government affairs change? Because when you first started, this was pre-cell phone, and now the connectivity is a lot bigger. Things really changed. Or how have you seen that change kind of from the inside?
Well, the whole culture has changed. When I first came, you crossed the aisle between Democrat and Republican, House and Senate easily. I mean, at that day, that was before 9/11, and you were walking both sides of the hill. You walked in the Capitol, you walked under the Capitol, and it was a great time to go back and forth. No matter who was in charge of the House or Senate Ag committees, you worked with both. You worked with the ranking member and his staff, and you worked with the chairman and their staff director. And in those days, those guys did talk. And you would go into a conference committee and they would go into closed session, but you were outside, and it was not unusual to have a member come out and say, well, now what do you think about this? How's that going to affect you guys? That's more rare today. We did a lot of cell phone work. We did a lot of sending messages back and forth with people. It was a slower time. I don't know that it was a better time, but it was a better time for government because it was a more open process between the Senate and the House and the Democrats and the Republicans. There weren't as many people. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, and I didn't start my career on Capitol Hill, so I had to learn it from the grassroots up, which was not all bad, because you learned what worked, what didn't work. Bottom line, it was then and is today all about personal relationships and trust. If you don't have a personal relationship, and if that person doesn't trust you, you're not going to get a lot done. And that part hasn't changed. Cell phones, texting. If I were a Hill staffer, I would like those old days because I didn't get 350 emails with attachments and all kinds of background material. The one thing that has not changed is that staff, maybe even more today, depends on you as a lobbyist for background information, and it better be right. I mean, you need to give the other side of the argument, you need to give your side of the argument, you need to tell them the bottom line, and that builds trust, and you have an open door to come back.
Now, I spoke to a former employee of yours at an NCA, and he said that one of the things that you did as soon as the budgetary constraints allowed for it was you hired some younger folks to be government affairs staffers. It was something kind of unusual at the time, with the intention of, let's have these younger staffers talk to the younger Hill staffers and see if relationships can get built that way. Why'd you feel that way?
Well, first of all, cattlemen are not known to be very open with their pocketbooks, so our budget wasn't very large. And it was not our philosophy to go out and hire lobby firms and law firms because you were speaking for cattlemen. You weren't speaking for corporate America. And yes, we went out preparing for the '85 Farm Bill. We hired some young folks, second, third, one might even been a first job out of college. But I established within that process a phrase, an old ranch phrase. I'd rather rein them in than have to spur them up. And we did a lot of reining in, but we built a fine crew. And I tell you, it's if I were to do it all over again, I'd do it that way. Because with my experience and my background and my bruises and hard knocks, I think if I were expanding an office today, I'd put key people in key positions and hire young, aggressive folks. I'm not talking about just necessarily 20-year-olds. They could be older, but they don't have to have a lot of experience here. But some attitude and culture is important as qualifications and experience.
You've been credited with playing a pretty big role in the '85 checkoff language that got into the Farm Bill, essentially created the beef checkoff. In your memory, just how heavy of a legislative lift was that checkoff?
I thought I was going to have to leave Washington. Oh, golly. The Senate was in Republican control. The House was in Democratic control. Kika de la Garza was chairman of the House committee, but Tony Coelho from California was the Livestock and Dairy subcommittee and had to go through Tony. On the Senate side, Jesse Helms was chairman, followed by Robert Dole, followed by Richard Lugar. And they were pretty anti-taxing, anti-government, just leave the producer alone. Tony came from a more progressive area, and he had a dairy background from California. His family had been was in the dairy business. And we ran this up the poll, and we found a good acceptance of our idea. But I was called in one day by Tony and said, I need a little thing in this farm bill, and I know you're going to have to fight me, but don't fight me to the death because I'm going to win. I need a dairy buyout. And I said, Tony, that'll never work. You can't have it. He said, I can get it. I've got enough votes. I said, I don't think you do, Tony. Went back within 2 days. I found out he had me beat by two votes on the subcommittee. So I said, Tony, we'll have to fight you, but I mean, it won't be one of those things where we let blood on the wall. You have the votes, you have the votes. California can't change your mind. Our California constituency can't change your mind. And I'll go to the Senate, and then we'll see what happens. And so we went to the Senate, and it was a very big experience over there because I had never been. I mean, I was just a fairly young, sniveling lobbyist, and here I was. The idea of a checkoff was fine, but they wanted a full refund, and they wanted all kinds of things in there from the Dole, Lugar, Helms crowd. Mm-hmm. And I said, no, I think we'll just go to a vote, Mr. Chairman. And what they didn't know is I'd been on the Democratic side working awfully hard. And we were having what was unusual in that time was to have particularly a Southern woman senator, and particularly one to be on the Ag Committee. And a lady by the name of Paula Hawkins from Florida was on the Ag Committee. And she had, over time, worked with our first woman president for the cattlemen at that time, Joanne Smith from Florida. So we had a strategy session one day and said, well, it can't hurt to see if Mrs. Hawkins will run this bill. And the thought was that Jesse's going to come unglued, but he is enough of a Southern gentleman, he's not going to take a lady down at the pulpit by her knees. And so Ms. Hawkins said, yeah, I'll run it for you. And we went over to John Melcher and several other people on the Democratic side from Montana and lined up all the votes on the Democratic side, and we kept going back. And these young bucks I was talking about, I said, you live on the Hill, you live with those staffers. You find out if the boss has a hiccup in the morning about this vote. And it came down to vote day, and we had the votes on the entire Senate committee except the chairman and the two ranking members. And I have never experienced such reaction in my life. I was a persona non grata with those men and their staff. So I was like, oh my, am I going to be any good in Washington? But as things go in Washington, as time heals up wounds, that healed. But that was a great experience. And the young folks that I'd hired, I mean, they were like, whoa, what's happening here? But that's how you earn the notches on your gun in Washington. You've got to have some tough stuff. I separate, and I get on my high horse sometimes, I separate the word lobbyist from the word monitor. Mm-hmm. So many people in Washington today calling themselves Washington offices, legislative council, lobbyists, are basically monitors. They are not lobbyists. They don't deliver the goods and they don't produce the votes.
Was the checkoff the toughest process for producing a bill in your career, or was there something else that kind of
That was the toughest one, I think. We had some tax fights over estate taxes and that type of thing, but we had a bigger audience to work with, a different alliance. When you spread out to a land issue or an EPA issue, you go out broader into agriculture. You get over into food, you've got a bigger group. we hooked up with the consumer groups on several issues like foreign meat inspection, equal to foreign meat inspection. That was, at that time, I was persona non grata with the food industry. But we were a little bit perturbed, but as we looked at more and more meat coming in, fresh meat, and looking at some of the inspection standards abroad, it was a two-tier system. We had to be up here with our inspection system with our domestically produced beef, and countries could be down here and we still allowed in. And we were able to do that. But that was a big consumer alliance. But the checkoff was probably the biggest single issue where we were out there alone. We were there. We were naked in the middle of Main Street trying to get votes.
Mm-hmm. What was the differences for you between working in Washington doing the government affairs stuff to all of a sudden you're the organization's CEO, spending a lot more time in Denver, I would imagine, doing a lot more organizational management things? What were the big differences for you there?
Well, we expanded the Washington office about fourfold after the '85 Farm Bill. We were able to get more memberships. The issues were increasing. Before that, we hadn't had the opportunity to take on a lot of additional issues. We added issues. Particularly a big one was state taxes and various tax issues. Environmental issues were coming on strong, so we added some young staff there. I still today have more fun doing issues and advocacy than I do administration. But being in Washington with a fairly large, we were up to about 23 in the Washington office at that time. So you had your own mini office administration with a lot of young people. You had some personnel challenges you wouldn't have with some older, more experienced people like we had in Denver. I found a big challenge was going to Denver and that staff saying, "What's this nickel politician know about running this outfit?" But golly, we were able to have a pretty good ride at that time, and we were told we could never merge the National Livestock and Meat Board and the National Cattlemen and have a working agreement with the Meat Export Federation and the National Beef Board. But after 2 years of hard work, I mean, it was like a corporate merger in many ways. We went to the trenches. We had problems. We had to come out. Remember staying up all night at the Marriott at the Kansas City airport with a couple of folks after the meeting had just blown up. I thought it was going to blow the building up. And we stayed behind, looked at each other and said, "What are we going to do?" And so we sat and talked and sat and talked. And the next day we put a little diagram down on the paper that started folks talking again. And so the merger finally came around about 2 years later.
Mm-hmm. And then after that, came back to D.C. working at USDA, and I've heard from some folks that were working in the industry at the time that particular branch of USDA under George W. Bush was, kind of there was a lot of similarities between folks that had been working in the industry for a while and the folks that were working at USDA at the time. Do you think that helped? I mean, that branch of experience there, the time that you had spent at NCA and NCBA, do you think that helped as you were all of a sudden on the government side of things?
Oh, of course. We also were up in a lot of focus and some crosshairs and under a lot of criticism because some groups accused the administration and the USDA of taking industry gophers and place them in positions that could do their bidding, which that is not the case. I mean, when you're working for the president, you're working for the people of the United States, you do what you're supposed to do. It did help to understand the issues. We had APHIS, and one of my first committees at the Cattlemen was staffing the Animal Health Committee many years before that. We had worked with APHIS on animal health, on import regulations, on foreign diseases, on animal care and welfare, over at Ag Marketing Service on grading. We'd back at my old NCA days, we'd changed the grading system a couple times. The one thing I had to get used to was all the commodity purchases for the Department of Defense and school lunch and everything, but it was so interesting at AMS. I was amazed at how much service the grain inspection folks were able to provide with small staff, and it was just, they're kind of under the radar group, and they were doing a fantastic job doing grain export out of here. Packers and stockyards, we needed to upgrade them a little bit, and they were good, well, to work with, but they had been ignored for a lot of years and had not maybe gotten some of the best instruction, and they performed. They did well, and My biggest satisfaction was to watch a guy that I would work for any day again, and that was Joe Hands. Secretary Joe Hands was the hardest working, most congenial, one of the smartest men I've ever seen and ever had the opportunity to work with. But we had a crisis one morning of a possible foot and mouth disease entry from Canada. We knew it couldn't be true, but we had to run it down on a load of pigs coming into Minnesota. He called a staff meeting in his office at 6 o'clock the next morning. That was at midnight. I came in early and I said, well, I'll go down and maybe I can get in. I walked in at 5:30 and he had his coffee at the desk waiting on me. I mean, there were about 30 people due, and I came in there he was 30 minutes early having coffee, getting ready for the day. And then I was so glad to see him be senator. Sorry that he didn't stay around longer, but it was a great experience. And of course, my partner Bruce Knight was absolutely great to work for. He had the conservation background, the grain commodity background. I had the livestock background, and so man, it was fun.
Mm-hmm. So after USDA, you go back to NCBA for a while, working in issues management, now doing something similar with Burton Eller Associates and the National Grange. So as you sit here today, what is the biggest difference in your business between today and when you first took your job with NCA in 1981 to come to Washington in the first place?
Oh gosh, the issues are many more, and they're much more rapid. Things can change on an issue overnight, depending on how much social media and who picks it up and who cares about it. It's hard to get things done to some extent because of that instantaneous media. Back when I first started, there were all kinds of monitoring groups and services on the press and on the media. Prior to fact checkers, you had folks that oversaw the media and said call people out if it wasn't true. Today, you can put anything on social media, and it doesn't even have to have a piece of truth in it, and it gets noticed. So, separating fact from fiction and half-truth today is probably the hardest thing I see happening.
In all of your years on working Capitol Hill, what's the funniest thing a lawmaker has ever said to you?
Oh golly,
maybe the funniest thing that you can repeat that a lawmaker has ever said to you.
That young staff you're talking about, I think would laugh about it today. Senator Melcher was a veterinarian. He was a crusty old codger that we had a lot of fun with. But John was better to talk to in the morning or later in the afternoon after lunch. He liked to take a little nap in his office. And during the Farm Bill debate in '85, we just needed to see John real bad, so we went in and had his appointment at 1 o'clock. And I'd heard that John, when everybody was out of there and he was by himself, he turned out all his cats, and he had a bunch of cats in his office. John loved cats. And I didn't realize, but he and the cats had been napping around there after lunch, waiting on the afternoon schedule. So I just walked in, sat down, and pretty soon I saw my black suit was completely covered with gray cat hair. And he said, I don't do cleaning either. So if you want to speak to me, you'll walk out with cat hair.
Oh, that's great. And when you're not working, when you're not up on Capitol Hill, what are some things that you like to do in your free time?
Oh golly, I don't have much free time. We still have cows down on Southwest Virginia, 30 miles from the Tennessee border. It's been a good ride for about 3 years. A lot tougher this year. We don't like those calf prices. They're about half where they were a year and a half ago. I'm blessed to have 7 grandkids and 5 children. My wife and I have 2 young daughters that are still at home. One's a gymnast looking to get to college next year and compete, and the other one is 13, and she's my farm girl, and we do a lot of fishing, we do a lot of gator, and we do a lot of tractor driving. So people say, why do you go fishing all the time? Well, I've got a young girl that likes to fish. She caught a 6 or 8 pound striped bass last summer. She got 19 smallmouth bass on the James River last fall, and in a little lake not far from where we live up in Maryland, she caught a 14-inch largemouth bass on Labor Day. So that's That's fun. I don't get any sleep, but I have a lot of fun.
Yeah. And I'll wrap up with this one, as I have in all the other ones as well. If you were to give any one piece of advice to the version of Burton Eller that walked into the job on his first day at NCA all those years ago, if you were to give him any one piece of advice, what would that be?
Oh gosh, come prepared. Know what you're talking about. Don't. We all have prejudices. Leave them at the door. By that I mean I may think this group or this lobbyist or that staffer may have a prejudice one way or the other. Leave yours at the door, because you might find a little opening there when you're talking to this person. Go to a mentor. I mean, if you have a mentor, I think just about everybody maybe you've talked to has had good mentors, and I've had a few, and that's fantastic. It always helps to have a mentor that can give you some advice. And never say never, because you never know what's possible, and you think you're going to go one way, you'll end up coming another way, and you think you can't get something through. Like I frankly told our folks at the Cattlemen that I don't think we got a chance getting this checkoff through this year, when we did, but we did. So don't ever give up. Go back to the old Winston Churchill, never ever give up.
Burton, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Spencer. My pleasure.